Okay, Rolf, I was going to start part two with the next stage, but you know, I wanted to elaborate a bit on the field bull because that's one of the iconic characters in British racing that you've sort of known personally. You know,
Not,
that,
sorry, not only him. He was the best by far. Great professional punter, great journalist. His racehorses, his writing in them is just, you understood the horse from what he was saying. He was just a brilliant journalist. I would put that top of all his credits. Ryan Price was an absolute genius, somebody you couldn't fathom. When he sacked me, he came into the office in his socks, said, "You know what pressure I'm under. I'm not going to go into that side of it. You know what pressure I'm under, Rolf. I'm going to have somebody else doing this job for next season." And he left, and then turned round, came back in the office, and said, "But out of loyalty to me, Rolf, will you show the next fellow the job?" and Toby Balding was, because he was such, not a playboy, but because he loved life too much and was larger than life, he didn't concentrate as much as he should have done on being a trainer. And then I had 5 years with him. Things did turn around. I'm not going to say it was down to me, but things did turn around because after I left, he had Gold Cup winners, Grand National winners again, and he picked it up again. And a person who can pick up from the depths that Toby was in. The year before I arrived, he had 11 winners, 10 of them with the same horse. And he picked them up and showed that he could do it. Elsie is something else again, and another person. I was lucky enough to give the address at his 80th party in the Jockey Club rooms. And what I would say now, that he's the only trainer to have 2 bronze statues of his horses on British racecourses, Desert Orchid at Kempton and Persian Punch at Newmarket. And they can't have a statue of Elsie, which they should have, because they threw the mould away when he was born.
you seem to have gravitated to big characters.
I'm just lucky. Why? I don't know. Just fortunate.
Now, go back to doing your timeline here. So you left Timeform. How long did you stay there?
14 months.
Right. And you went to India, and I'm guessing that wasn't a racing
No,
posting.
I went to India. I tried to go there for voluntary service overseas, and they saw straight through me and turned me down. So I went under my own steam. And there was supposedly a famine in Bihar, which is still the poorest state in India. And I got taken on as a volunteer straight away by one of the church missions. And then I got very ill. And when I came out of hospital, there was a big well drilling rig that was going south, heading to a Tibetan camp. And they took me on board. And I was just very lucky that they took me on board. And eventually I stayed on it. I was there for 2 years, and the other people, foreigners, left. And so I ended up, not running it. I left that to the Indian engineer, but I was the sort of titular head. And there is a story. It sounds a bit far-fetched, but in Bihar, Marlon Brando came out, and he said, I'm going to have a fleet of helicopters to take the relief supplies to the villages and things. And I said, "Mr. Brando," and he said, "No, call me Marlon." And I said, "No, Mr. Brando," I said, "we can't hardly service a bicycle here. How are we going to service helicopters?" Well, he took it the wrong way and went off to America, and we never saw any helicopters. Not that we could have kept them in the air. I know that sounds, but that's how people misrepresented what was going off in Bihar. The crops had failed to a certain extent, but then Bihar is always the poorest state in India anyway, and it was an opportunity for relief agencies and missions, mainly Christian missions, to raise their profile by, I wouldn't say inventing a famine, but there wasn't a famine. I only ever saw one cow die.
Now, the Phil Bull said that racing was the great triviality. So did you sort of decide to leave the trivial stuff and do a bit of philanthropy?
You could say that, but it's not true, because Phil didn't say that. He did say it's the great triviality in the context of life. He didn't call it a triviality as such, but in the context of life.
But is that something you took on board?
Yes.
You decided to do some good rather than pick a few winners?
Absolutely.
Okay, no, but when you're in India, it didn't take you long to gravitate towards racing, or did it take you long? But eventually you did gravitate towards racing.
I did, but that was after I'd been at Toby's.
So this is another time you went over there.
Yeah, I've been over many times, and people who are the Cyrus Poonawallas.
Was there a connection to India? Sorry to interrupt there.
None whatsoever, really.
So why India of all the places that probably needed...
Well, because there was supposedly this famine on. I'd been indoctrinated, television, newspapers, that's what was happening, and that's why I went. As far as racing in India was concerned, I was at Toby's, and there was an Anglo-Indian girl as assistant trainer for a while. Every odd and sod turns up at Toby's, I assure you. And when she went back to India to train, her father had a stud out there, and he'd bought a stallion, Pink Tank it was called, ran for, what's his name? Oh, I forget now. Ryan, John Ryan's father, Mick. And anyway, it was a bit of a scare. It wasn't good enough, but he went out there with 2 mares, and I flew them out there. I went in the plane with the horse and 2 mares, and they first of all went to a stud, the Palace Stud in Bangalore, which was, the palace was the Maharaja of Mysore's summer palace. It was cooler in Bangalore than in Mysore, and he would come there for the summer, except that the Indian government had taken away his and all the other Rajas titles. But that's slightly another thing. But in the elephant houses, there was a stud, and it was run by an old Englishman called Sam Hill, and he came from Bath originally, and his son David took over from him as training in Madras, and David then went on to train in Hong Kong successfully, in Singapore. Sam was getting old, and having an Englishman turn up at the stud like that, and the fact that he'd been in racing, we got on like a house on fire. And so when he had to leave, I took over running of the stud. Goodness knows what they thought of me. And so did that for a season. And by this time, what with the experiences in Bihar and then the experiences in Bangalore, I was totally hooked on India, and that's why I go back as often as I can.
Now, tell us a bit more about Sam Hill. He was the first trainer in the world to go through the card.
Yeah, I've got it, the thing on my wall there. The John Randall of the Racing Post asked me about it and did a lovely article with a picture of Sam leading a winner in. He had all 7 winners at a place called Uttakamund, which is in South India, and was one of these hill stations where the British used to go for the hot weather, and they built a racecourse there. And it's a very dinky racecourse, lovely little racecourse. And Sam went through the car. They were thoroughbreds. It was proper racing. And yes, he was the first person to go through the card as a trainer.
So I'm going to go back through some of these characters. You mentioned them a bit.
Yeah.
Ryan Price. Now, I've read a book years ago on Ryan Price, Right Hard Case.
Price of Success.
I can't remember which one it was now.
Yeah,
but he
by
struck,
Peter Bromley.
was it?
Yeah.
But I got it in the library in
Yeah.
Tiverton years ago. But he was a right hard case, wasn't he?
He was very much a hard case. He was, but I mean, I'm not going to in any way denigrate Ryan.
And where I come from, that's a compliment.
He lived by his own rules. Am I going to say that he should have been banned for doping the Schweppes things? Never in a million years, because
They made their own dope, didn't they?
they apparently made their own dope. There is a story which I'm sure you daren't put on the camera, but it was said, or this was the sort of fable that went round Findon, that he got wind through an associate of a drug that allowed aging homosexuals, this is not fantasy, and I'm not naming names, allowed aging homosexuals to carry on with their sexual proclivities. There you are, a euphemism after another. And he said to this, oh, try this on a horse. And it was said that he tried it on a horse, which Fred Winter rode and did a double somersault at the first hurdle at Newbury. Fred got off and came back and said, I'm never riding one of those again. So it was left to the Josh Giffords of this world. I think this is all a fable, but this is the story that I was told, the real story of the Schweppes winners. Take it or leave it.
Right, now you mentioned before, and you did say that you didn't want to go into why, but you got the sack. But you got the sack after his best ever season.
Yes.
Which must have been a bit of a shock or a bit disappointing.
Yes, it was disappointing, actually. We had more winners and more prize money than he'd ever had. I did drop one, can I use the word bollock?
Of course you can.
But it wasn't my fault, I swear. We had, you used to have to enter in the spring, winter for races later on, and there was no way of paying what they call it, fee to get in at a later stage. And we came right through the season and got to the week before the futurity, the Timeform Gold Cup at I think it was the Observer Gold Cup in this year at Doncaster, and Ryan came in and he said, you've entered Gairloch, haven't you? And I said, no, Governor, I'm sorry, I haven't. He said, why not? I said, well, it wasn't even in the yard when the entries closed. And I said, the owner, she was an old lady called Miss Herman Hodge, Vera Herman Hodge, Violet Herman Hodge. She would like to keep her horses at home and put them into training as late as possible, save money. And Gairloch we hadn't even got it on the books when the entries closed. And I didn't know it was coming. I think Ryan probably did. So I didn't enter it. I didn't know it existed. And Ryan was marvellous at forgiving errors. If anybody ever did anything wrong, he was brilliant at forgiving you, or rather realising if there were circumstances beyond your control. That didn't mean to say he didn't sack me.